Picture this: September 20th, 1792. The fields of Champagne are a sea of mud, drenched by a freezing, relentless rain. Through the mist, the most feared army in Europe advances: the professional Prussians, the invincible heirs of Frederick the Great. They expect the ragged mob of French revolutionaries facing them to scatter at the first cannon shot. They are advancing on a rabble. But the rabble doesn't run. They stand. And in that moment, the entire history of the world pivots forever. To truly understand the miracle at Valmy, you must first comprehend the nightmare that birthed it. You must feel the terror, the paranoia, and the sheer existential desperation of a nation consuming itself alive. The year is 1792, and France is not a functioning nation. It is an open wound, a body politic in the final, agonizing throes of a fever. Just 3 years have passed since the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. That single, symbolic act of violence did not just tear down a medieval prison, it shattered the very foundations of 1,000 years of unbroken monarchy, 1,000 years of absolute, divinely ordained certainty. The ancien régime, the old order of kings who ruled by divine right, of nobles who paid no taxes while peasants starved, and of a church that owned 10% of all the land in France, was burning. What had begun years earlier as a demand for fiscal reform, driven by the crippling debt from France's intervention in the American Revolutionary War, what had started as a plea for bread in the markets of Paris had metastasized, fueled by the intellectual fire of the Enlightenment. The ideas of Rousseau, of Voltaire, of popular sovereignty had escaped the salons and entered the streets. The demand was no longer for reform, it was for revolution. And at the centre of this hurricane was a man tragically unfit for the moment. King Louis XVI was not a tyrant in the mould of his predecessors. He was a well-meaning, pious, but fatally indecisive man, more comfortable tinkering with locks in his workshop or studying geography than navigating the brutal politics of a nation in collapse. He was a prisoner in his own capital, a man trapped in the Tuileries Palace, watching helplessly as the absolute power his ancestors had wielded evaporated like morning mist. He had accepted a constitution he despised, sworn oaths to a nation he no longer recognized, and waited, quiet and fatalistic, hoping desperately for rescue by the armies of his fellow monarchs. This simmering, toxic distrust between the king and his people, between the old order and the new, reached its final, irreversible boiling point in the dark of night, on June 20th, 1791. The flight to Varennes. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. The royal family, disguised in a massive, custom-built and fatally conspicuous carriage, fled Paris. They were not just fleeing the city, they were fleeing towards the Austrian border, towards the armies of France's enemies, where the Queen's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, was massing troops. This was not an escape, it was a defection. They were stopped in the small town of Varennes, not by an army, but by a local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who recognized the king's familiar face from his portrait on a 50-livre assignat, a piece of revolutionary paper money. The king's carriage was surrounded by armed peasants. His escape had failed. They were dragged back to the capital in utter, profound humiliation, forced to ride for days through silent, hostile crowds who no longer removed their hats in his presence. It was proof, irrefutable, damning proof. The king, who had sworn a sacred oath to uphold the new constitution, was a liar. He was actively conspiring with foreign monarchs to invade his own country and crush the revolution with foreign bayonets. Trust was not merely broken, it was annihilated. The king was a traitor. In Paris, the radical political clubs, most notably the Jacobins, seized the moment. Figures like Danton and Robespierre began to argue with a terrifying new logic. How can the revolution be safe, they asked, when a perjured king still sits on the throne? How can France be free when every other monarch in Europe is plotting its destruction? The Girondin faction, then in ascendance, saw war not as a threat, but as a political opportunity. They believed, with a dangerous messianic idealism, that a war of peoples against kings would expose the king's final treachery and unite the nation in a patriotic fervour. They believed the oppressed peoples of Austria and Prussia would see the French armies as liberators, that they would rise up and join the glorious crusade. It was a fantasy, but a potent one. On April the 20th, 1792, the new Legislative Assembly, full of passionate but dangerously inexperienced idealists, formally declared war on Austria. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Prussia, Austria's ally and possessing the most disciplined, feared military machine in Europe, immediately joined the fight. A great coalition of monarchs, the First Coalition, began to assemble on France's borders, dedicated to one simple, brutal goal: march on Paris, strangle the revolution in its cradle, and restore the Bourbon monarchy by force. The stakes were absolute. For the kings and emperors of Europe, this was a war against a political plague, a dangerous idea of liberty and equality that threatened to topple every throne from Madrid to St. Petersburg. For the revolutionaries in Paris, this was a war of total survival. They knew exactly what would happen if the disciplined armies of Prussia and Austria reached the capital. There would be no trials, no negotiations, only ropes, firing squads, and the restoration of a king who would rule through terror. The air in Paris became thick with suspicion, a collective psychosis. Every aristocrat was a spy. Every priest who refused the new oath was a traitor. This paranoia culminated in the bloody storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792, where the king's 800 Swiss guards, in an act of suicidal loyalty, were massacred by the Parisian mob. The royal family fled, only to be imprisoned in the Temple fortress. The monarchy was finished, but the fear remained. The Prussian army was getting closer. What about the prisoners? What about the thousands of royalists, priests, and aristocrats filling the city's jails? What if they broke out and attacked the city from within when the Prussians arrived? This fear led directly to the September massacres, several days of horrific, organised butchery. Panicked mobs, incited by radical journalists, dragged more than 1,200 men, women and priests from the city's jails and slaughtered them in the streets with pikes, axes and swords. This was the existential crisis, the backdrop of terror, political failure and imminent invasion that set the stage for Valmy. But the political chaos, the paranoia, the fall of the monarchy and the massacres in the streets, all of it paled in comparison to the military reality. Because the greatest, most immediate threat to Paris wasn't just the invading armies. It was the horrifying fact that the very army meant to defend France had already collapsed from within. To defend a nation on fire, you first need a sword. The tragedy for France in 1792 was that its sword was not merely dull, it was fundamentally, catastrophically broken. An army is not just a collection of men with guns, it is a complex organism, a nervous system built on centuries of knowledge, tradition, discipline, and above all, trust. The revolution, in its righteous and necessary fury to destroy the privileges of the old order, had decapitated its own military. Of the roughly 12,000 officers in the old Royal Army, somewhere between 6,000 and perhaps as many as 9,000, a staggering 60 to 75%, had fled the country. They had emigrated, becoming émigrés. These were not just any men, idly holding ceremonial posts. These were the noblesse d'épée, the nobility of the sword, the only men in France who knew how to manage the complex logistics of procuring forage and bread for 50,000 troops, the only men who understood the arcane mathematics of artillery, the only men who had studied the principles of siege warfare and grand strategy. They were the army's entire institutional memory. They were its nervous system, and they were gone, gathering in cities like Koblenz, openly forming counter-revolutionary armies, waiting to return alongside the Prussians to reclaim their lost world. What remained in France was a terrifying, dysfunctional hybrid, two mutually hostile armies forced to share the same camps and standards, hating each other far more than they hated the approaching enemy. On one side, you had the remnants of the old Royal Army, the career soldiers, the veterans who had served the king. They were known as les Blancs, the Whites, for the white coats of the Bourbon monarchy. These were the long-serving sergeants and adjutants, men who had fought against the British in the American War, men who knew the agonizingly slow process of siege warfare, who knew their drill by heart, who respected the mathematics of firepower. But they were hollowed out. They looked at the new revolutionary representatives on missions sent from Paris, political commissars who were often lawyers or journalists, with utter, undisguised contempt. Their loyalty was to their regiment, to their traditions, perhaps to France, but certainly not to the Parisian politicians who had murdered their social order and promoted amateurs above their heads. They had lost their officers, their king, and their entire reason for fighting. On the other side, you had the new blood, the volunteers of 1791 and 1792. They were les Bleus, the Blues, named for their new rough-cut blue National Guard uniforms. These men were the Revolution. They were shopkeepers from the Rue Saint-Antoine, lawyers from provincial towns, farmers from the Vendée, artisans from Lyon, all citizens filled with a fiery, passionate, almost holy fervour. This was the famous élan, the spirit that would one day conquer Europe. They genuinely believed they were on a crusade to liberate mankind. They marched singing the Ça ira and La Marseillaise, promising to hang the last king with the entrails of the last priest, but they had zero training. They had never heard a cannon fired in anger. They marched in wooden clogs because there were no boots. Many carried pikes because the armories were empty. They didn't know how to form a line, how to march in step, or how to stand when disciplined cavalry approached. Worse, they were consumed by paranoia. They saw every Blanc officer, every veteran of the old army, as a potential traitor, a royalist, just waiting for the moment to betray the army to the Prussians. Imagine the scene in the camp. The Bleus would see the Blancs practicing their complex silent linear drills, a relic of the old regime, and see it as aristocratic and unpatriotic. The Blanc NCO would order a Bleu volunteer to clean his musket. The volunteer, citing his rights as a free citizen, might refuse, accusing the NCO of being a royalist tyrant. The chain of command was not just broken, it was inverted. Discipline, the very soul of an army, had evaporated. And in April 1792, the Assembly in Paris ordered this fractured, schizophrenic weapon to strike. The plan, championed by the Girondin politician and now general Charles Dumouriez, was to invade the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. He assured the Assembly it would be a promenade militaire, a military walk. The Belgian people, he promised, oppressed by Austria, would rise up as one and greet the French soldiers as liberators. It was a delusion. The invasion was a catastrophe from the very first step. The French advanced in several columns, all disorganized, all suspicious of each other. The enemy they met was not even the main Austrian army. It was merely an outpost at Marcain, a few hundred disciplined Austrian troops who calmly formed a line and prepared to fire. The moment the first Austrian shots whistled over their heads, the raw Bleu battalions did not hesitate. They panicked. The cry went up, "Nous sommes trahis." We are betrayed. It was not a conclusion they reached, it was their starting assumption. They believed their blank officers were leading them into a trap. The retreat was not orderly. It was a stampede. They dissolved, throwing down their new muskets, many unfired, and fleeing back towards the French border, a terrified mob. General Theobald Dillon, an experienced soldier of Irish descent, a man who had faithfully served France his entire life, tried to rally his panicked troops. For his efforts, they accused him of being the chief traitor. They dragged him from his horse into the streets of Lille. They hacked him to pieces with their bayonets and sabres. They mutilated his corpse and paraded it through the city as a trophy. This was the army of France in 1792, an armed mob that murdered its own generals. The Prussian High Command, led by the cautious Duke of Brunswick, heard these reports. Their spies saw it, and it confirmed everything they believed. The French army was not an army. It was a diseased, self-destructing rabble. The invasion of France would not be a war. It would be a police action, a simple march to Paris to restore order. While the French army was busy murdering its own generals, the most feared military machine in Europe began its slow, methodical, unstoppable march. This was the Prussian army. They were not just soldiers, they were the living, breathing testament to the genius of Frederick the Great, an 18th century masterpiece of human engineering, a walking anachronism of terrifying efficiency. For nearly half a century, their reputation was the absolute gold standard of European warfare. Their infantry, trained through relentless soul-crushing drill at Potsdam, moved not like individual men, but like interconnected parts of an automaton, a single, terrifying organism of iron and absolute obedience. This was a Kadavergehorsam, the obedience of a corpse. They were the undisputed masters of linear warfare, the kings of the parade ground volley, capable of firing 3 rounds a minute, advancing, wheeling, and reforming under fire with a precision that other armies could only dream of. They moved in perfect, rigid lines of dark blue, their white cross-belts immaculate, their powdered hair cued precisely. They had humbled the Austrians in the Silesian Wars. They had faced down the combined might of Europe in the 7 Years' War and survived. They were, in the summer of 1792, considered simply invincible. This was not an opinion, it was an accepted fact. Leading this grey-coated juggernaut was Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick. He was 68 years old, a living fossil from the previous age of warfare, a man who had served under Frederick himself, and who had earned a formidable reputation. But Brunswick was a man who understood the precise, predictable, gentlemanly warfare of kings, a vast, intricate chessboard of manoeuvre, where armies tried to outflank each other, cut supply depots, and win conflicts through attrition, not annihilation. He profoundly despised the revolution. He saw it not as a legitimate political movement, but as a breakdown of civilization, a messy, chaotic, emotional outburst by the lower orders, a political plague that must be scoured from the earth. He simply could not comprehend that a shoemaker from Paris or a lawyer from Bordeaux, filled with an abstract idea of la patrie, could stand against a disciplined Prussian grenadier who had been trained for 20 years to obey. To make matters worse, Brunswick was not even in supreme command. King Frederick William II of Prussia, a monarch eager for glory but prone to romantic notions and indecision, was with the army. Brunswick had to manage not just a military campaign, but a king, slowing his advance to accommodate royal whim. His caution was not just strategic, it was political. And so, in this atmosphere of supreme confidence and aristocratic contempt, Brunswick made the first critical mistake. A political blunder so vast, so catastrophic, that it would prove more devastating than any tactical error. On July 25, 1792, from his headquarters in Koblenz, he issued a proclamation that would live in infamy: the Brunswick Manifesto. It was a document drafted largely by the French émigrés, the vengeful nobles who had fled France and who were desperate to terrify the population into submission. They whispered in the ears of the King and Brunswick, assuring them that the French people were just waiting for a strong hand, that they would welcome the invaders as liberators from the Jacobin mob. This was the fatal echo chamber of exiles, and Brunswick listened. The manifesto was the voice of the ancien régime, dripping with contempt, threatening horrific retribution. It declared that the Allied armies were invading to restore King Louis XVI to his rightful, absolute power. It stated that any National Guardsman who dared to fight would be punished as a rebel and shot. And most fatefully, it threatened the city of Paris itself with total military execution and complete subversion if the slightest violence or outrage was committed against the king or queen. It was meant to paralyze France with fear. It was meant to sever the link between the people and the radicals. It achieved the exact opposite. It galvanized France with a white-hot, unifying rage. This was not a diplomatic warning. It was a death warrant. It was irrefutable proof of what the most radical Jacobins had been screaming for months. The king was actively conspiring with the enemy. This invasion was not a foreign war. It was a war to reshackle the French people. The manifesto didn't cow Paris. It destroyed the last remnants of support for the monarchy, triggering the storming of the Tuileries Palace just 2 weeks later and leading directly to the September massacres. It turned a political conflict into a war of national survival. But the immediate military threat was real, and it was overwhelming. The Allied army, a combined force of Prussians, Austrians, Hessians, and the vengeful French émigré corps, began its invasion. The exact numbers, like much from this chaotic period, are debated by historians. But the main invasion force under Brunswick probably numbered around 42,000 Prussians, supported by other contingents, bringing the total Allied strength in the theatre to perhaps as many as 80,000 men. It was, regardless of the precise count, the largest, most professional, most lethal army to invade France in living memory. And at first, their confidence seemed entirely justified. The advance was methodical, inexorable. The army of cowards, as the Prussians called them, seemed to live up to its name. The French border fortresses, which should have held for months, which were designed by the great Vauban to bleed an enemy dry, collapsed in days. The fortress of Longwy was the first to fall on August 23rd. Its commander, demoralized and facing a terrified civilian population, surrendered after only minimal resistance. Then came Verdun, the great symbolic fortress of the eastern frontier, the Shield of Paris, a name that would echo with blood again a century later. The Prussian siege guns opened fire. The town's political leaders, terrified of suffering the fate promised in Brunswick's manifesto, forced the military commander, Colonel Beaurepaire, to capitulate. Beaurepaire, seeing his defence betrayed from within, reportedly shot himself rather than sign the surrender. He became the revolution's first great martyr. The Prussians, brushing the dust from their uniforms, simply noted another failure of French spirit and marched on. Verdun fell on September 2nd, the very day the massacres began in Paris. The news, arriving simultaneously, hit the capital like a physical blow. The path was open. The last major obstacle between Brunswick's army and the capital was gone. The road to Paris lay wide open. The only thing standing between Brunswick's disciplined legions and a defenceless Paris was not in truth an army. It was not a grand strategy. It was two men. Two generals who, in a twist of fate only a revolution could produce, represented the absolute polar opposite extremes of France, and who despised each other with a raw, professional passion. The first, and the nominal commander, was Charles-François Dumouriez. He was 53 years old, and perhaps the most dangerously ambitious, complicated, and morally flexible man in the entire nation. He was a pure, unadulterated product of the ancien regime he now served to destroy. He had been an adventurer, a diplomat, a secret agent who had served King Louis XV in the complex, cynical diplomacy of the Old World. He had fought in the 7 Years' War. He had plotted in Poland. He had even seen the inside of the Bastille himself, imprisoned years earlier for his complex intrigues. He was not a revolutionary idealist like the Jacobins in Paris. He was not a true believer. He was a supreme pragmatist, a high-stakes political gambler who saw the revolution not as a holy crusade, but as a vehicle for his own towering ambition, a chaotic storm that a clever man could ride to supreme power. He had briefly been the Girondin Minister of Foreign Affairs, the very man whose fiery nationalist rhetoric had pushed the Assembly to declare this disastrous war, a war he was now, through a twist of fate, expected to command. He was brilliant, he was charismatic, he was relentlessly energetic, and he was utterly untrustworthy. His volunteer soldiers, the Bleus, adored him. He spoke their language of liberty. He praised their spirit. He embodied the revolutionary élan they believed would conquer kings, even as he privately despaired of their indiscipline. The politicians in Paris, however, feared him, seeing in his popularity and undeniable competence the terrifying shadow of a new military dictator, a French Caesar just waiting for his moment. He arrived on the frontier at Sedan in August and took command of what was called the Army of the North. It was a command in name only. He found the chaos left by the Dillon massacre. He found fear, incompetence, and soldiers who would rather debate orders in political clubs than obey them. He knew, with the cold certainty of a professional gambler, that he could not fight the Prussians in the open. His Bleus would dissolve under volley fire, and his Blancs might defect. He needed a miracle. Or failing that, he needed geography. Dumouriez looked at the map. Between Brunswick and Paris lay the great forest of the Argonne. It was a dense, dark, almost primeval barrier of wooded hills, thick brush, and marshy river valleys, stretching for nearly 40 miles. It was, he realized, a natural fortress, a wall. This wall could only be passed by an army with its artillery and supply wagons through 5 narrow gaps, or passes: Grandpré, Croix-aux-Bois, Chêne Populeux, Chalade, and Les Ilettes. If a handful of Spartans could hold the pass at Thermopylae against the Persian horde, perhaps a handful of Frenchmen could hold the Argonne against the Prussians. This was his plan. It was brilliant. It was desperate. He would turn this forest into the Thermopylae of France. He would divide his small, unreliable army of perhaps 25,000 men and garrison these passes. He would force the cautious Duke of Brunswick, a man who hated risk, to stop his parade march and fight for every muddy, wooded inch. This would buy time. Time was the true objective. Time for the rain to fall, to turn the roads to impassable sludge. Time for the infamous Prussian supply lines, their one great weakness, to collapse under the strain. Time for dysentery, the sixth general of every 18th century army, to spread through the Prussian camp. And time, perhaps, for the nation to rally. It was a plan that relied entirely on defence, on terrain, and on the hope that his demoralised troops could hold a fortified line against the most disciplined infantry in the world. But Dumouriez commanded only one of the armies in the sector. The other, the army of the centre, was commanded by a man who was his exact opposite in every conceivable way. François-Christophe Kellermann. Kellermann was 67 years old. He was a professional soldier's soldier. An Alsatian born near Strasbourg, he was technically German in blood, but fiercely French in loyalty, and he had served the King of France for 50 years. 50 years. He was a Blanc to his very core. He had joined the army as a cavalry volunteer at 15, fought with distinction in the 7 Years' War, and risen slowly, grindingly, from the absolute lowest ranks to become a general through sheer methodical competence. He was all procedure, discipline, and mathematics. He believed in supply lines. He believed in drill. He believed in the awesome crushing power of a perfectly timed cavalry charge by professionals. He despised politicians. He despised the chaos of the revolution, the rabble of the Bleus, with their patriotic songs and their wooden shoes, and the wild, romantic, unproven fantasies of political generals like Charles Dumouriez. He was horrified by the murder of General Dillon and the breakdown of all military order. He saw the volunteer battalions not as the soul of the new France, but as a dangerous liability, a disorganized mob that would get his professionals killed. His motivation for being here was not ideology. It was patriotism. He was defending the soil of France, not the Jacobin clubs of Paris. When Dumouriez, the political schemer, sent word of his Argonne plan to Kellermann, the old veteran, Kellermann was appalled. He saw the plan for what it was, a desperate, amateurish, and tactically suicidal gamble. Dumouriez was scattering his forces. He was violating the single most important cardinal rule of warfare, concentration of force. He was dividing the army into small, isolated packets, penny packets, each one of which could be overwhelmed and destroyed by the main Prussian force one by one. If Brunswick simply concentrated his 42,000 men on the Croix-aux-Bois pass, held by only a few thousand, he would smash through, and the entire French line would collapse, its remaining forces trapped and annihilated. This was not war. This was suicide. Kellermann argued for concentration. Bring the armies together, his own 22,000 men, and Dumouriez's 25,000, find good, solid defensive ground, and prepare for a proper, professional battle where their superior artillery could make a difference. Dumouriez ignored him. He was the senior commander, and his was the grand strategy. He ordered Kellermann not to join him, but to act as a mobile reserve, to move his army to a position south of the Argonne, near Saint-Menehould, to plug any gap the Prussians might create. The distrust between the two men was palpable, a physical thing in the French camp. Kellermann, the professional, was being ordered to risk his entire army, the last real army France possessed, on the fantasy of a politician. He obeyed, with the heavy, bitter heart of a soldier, convinced that Dumouriez was leading them all to ruin. Dumouriez's grand strategy, his meticulously planned Thermopylae of France, lasted barely a week. The plan was clever on paper, perhaps too clever, relying on scattered, demoralized troops to hold 5 different passes against the most disciplined army in Europe. It was doomed. The Prussians, led by the methodical, cautious Duke of Brunswick, did not bother with the suicidal frontal assaults Dumouriez had anticipated. They probed, they tested the lines, they gathered intelligence, and they found the weak point. It was the Croix-aux-Bois Pass, a northern route that Dumouriez had initially considered less important, garrisoning it lightly with Green Volunteer battalions. On September the 12th, a combined Prussian-Austrian force struck the pass hard. The French volunteers, untested and badly led, broke almost instantly, abandoning the position and fleeing into the woods. The entire Argonne line, the great natural fortress that was supposed to bleed the Prussians dry for weeks, was rendered utterly useless in a single afternoon. Panic erupted in the French headquarters. Dumouriez's grand defensive line had not just been breached, it had been decisively flanked. His army was now in mortal danger of being trapped between the main Prussian force advancing through the shattered pass and the Austrian army pressing from the north. His strategy had failed completely. Now there was only survival. He ordered a desperate, chaotic retreat southward, abandoning the Argonne, desperately trying to link up with Kellermann's approaching Army of the Centre, before Brunswick could catch him in the open and destroy his army piece by piece. It became a frantic, muddy race, a race between 2 fractured French armies whose commanders despised each other, trying to unite, and the Prussian juggernaut, which now had a clear path to Paris, trying to intercept them. Kellermann, the old Alsatian veteran, was furious. His worst predictions had come true. The politician's fantasy had collapsed, and now he, the professional, had to clean up the mess. His army, the Army of the Centre, was now the only coherent, disciplined force capable of standing between Brunswick and the capital. He marched his 22,000 men through the driving rain, pushing them to their limits, his cavalry screens fending off Prussian probes. On the afternoon of September 19th, 1792, Kellermann's exhausted lead elements arrived near the small village of Valmy. He rode ahead to survey the landscape. It was terrible country for a battle. It was not the open plain that cavalry commanders dreamed of. It was a rolling, sodden landscape of hills, wet woods, and small streams that had become muddy torrents. But one feature stood out, rising above the surrounding low ground. It was a hill, a broad ridge, dominated by a single, sturdy windmill. This was the high ground. This was the only defensible position in the entire sector. From here, his artillery could command the main road. Kellermann ordered his army to occupy it immediately. He placed his best artillery batteries in an arc around the windmill, turning the hill into a makeshift, muddy fortress of cannon and resolve. He didn't know it, but he had just chosen the precise battlefield that would decide the fate of the revolution. But as Kellermann's men shivered in the cold rain and began to dig in, their enemy was fighting a different kind of war. A war they were decisively, catastrophically losing. The Prussian army, the invincible heirs of Frederick, were being destroyed not by French bullets, but by the French weather and their own failed logistics. It had rained. It had rained for 2 weeks without stopping. A cold, miserable, torrential downpour that turned the chalky soil of the Champagne region into an ocean of thick, clinging, inescapable mud. This was not the kind of mud soldiers complain about. This was mud that sucked wagons down to their axles, that pulled horses to their deaths, that made every step for an infantryman a struggle for survival. The Prussian supply lines, already stretched perilously thin over 200 miles back to the German border, simply collapsed. The Prussian army had marched into France expecting a short, glorious campaign, a promenade militaire to Paris. They had brought minimal supplies of flour, expecting to live off the land, requisitioning food from a defeated and supposedly welcoming populace. But the French populace was not welcoming. They were hostile. This was not a war of kings. It was a war of people. Peasants burned their own crops, poisoned their wells, and formed guerrilla bands that ambushed and slaughtered Prussian foraging parties. The police action had become a war against an entire nation. And so the Prussians began to starve, in their sodden camps, unable to get dry, unable to get bread. The inevitable happened. Sickness. Not just coughs and colds, but dysentery, the bloody flux. It swept through the Prussian army like wildfire. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a biological catastrophe. Soldiers, weakened by hunger, suffering from exposure, and drinking contaminated water, were dying in their hundreds. Estimates from contemporary journals, including that of Goethe himself, suggest that of the 42,000 Prussians who had marched so confidently into France, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 were now critically ill, too weak to hold a musket, let alone march in a disciplined line. The invincible army was a walking hospital, a ghost of itself, leaving a trail of its own dead in the mud. This was the force that arrived before Valmy. This was the reality that Brunswick faced. He knew his army was rotting from the inside out. He knew his supply lines were cut. He knew every day he waited. His army grew weaker. But when the thick morning fog finally began to lift on September 20th, he saw Kellermann's army on the hill. He saw the mob, the shoemakers, the lawyers, formed up in their ragged blue lines, waiting for him. He still had the advantage in professional infantry. He still had the reputation of Frederick the Great. He still believed that one professional, disciplined push would be enough to shatter this revolutionary rabble and end the war. He prepared his men for the attack. The battle began not with a clash of steel, but with a deep, deafening rolling roar of thunder. It was the sound of kings, the voice of the ancien régime. The Prussians, having methodically deployed their lines of blue-coated infantry, began the work they assumed would be short, a mere formality before the main assault. Their artillery, some 36 heavy guns, opened fire around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This was the standard, gentlemanly overture to an 18th century battle. You pound the enemy line with heavy cannonballs from a safe distance. You watch the raw, untrained militia, the shoemakers and the peasants, panic, dissolve, break, and run. Then, and only then, do you send in the disciplined infantry to clean up the mess, a simple police action to disperse the remaining rabble. This was the accepted mathematics of war. But the French line did not break. It did not waver. It answered. And it answered with a fury and a professionalism that shattered the Prussian High Command's most basic assumptions. Here, in the mud of Champagne, the invaders' entire worldview collided with a reality they had completely, arrogantly ignored. The Revolutionary Army was indeed a fractured mess of amateurs, except for one critical component, its artillery. By a strange miracle of history, the French Royal Artillery, the Blancs serving the guns, was the single most professional, most technologically advanced, and most lethal artillery corps on earth. This was the life's work of one man, Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval. Gribeauval was not a revolutionary. He was a brilliant, obsessive engineer of the old regime. For 15 years before the Bastille ever fell, he had undertaken a complete root and branch reform of French cannons, a process that had taken over 15 years. He had looked at the old system, where every gun was a unique namepiece of bronze art, like the Scourge or Le Victorieux, and seen it for what it was, a logistical nightmare. They were too heavy, their ammunition wasn't interchangeable, their parts couldn't be swapped. They were medieval relics. Gribeauval shattered this system. He introduced standardization on a level the world had never seen, an industrial age concept applied to a pre-industrial craft. Barrels were lighter, cast with new precision techniques, making them far more mobile on a muddy field than their heavy, cumbersome Prussian counterparts. Carriages were standardized. A wheel from one gun would fit any other of its class. Even the screws and bolts were standardized. This was the Industrial Revolution applied to warfare, decades before its time. But the genius of the Gribeauval system went further. His new guns came with calibrated rear sights and, crucially, elevating screws for precise targeting. While Prussian gunners were still hammering wooden wedges under the breech to aim, French gunners could adjust their elevation with a simple turn of a crank, allowing for rapid, precise changes in range. And their ammunition? It was pre-packaged. Powder charges were measured in a factory, not guessed on the field, and sealed in flannel bags attached directly to the cannonball, allowing for a faster, safer, and far more reliable rate of fire. And the men serving these weapons? They were not the bleu volunteers, the shoemakers and lawyers who filled the infantry ranks. They were the blancs. They were the career professionals, the grizzled veterans, the mathematicians of warfare who had served King Louis for 20 years. They were a corps d'élite, recruited not from the dregs of society, but from intelligent, skilled artisans who understood trigonometry and physics. They were, in the supreme irony of the day, royalists. Many of them secretly despised the revolution they were now forced to serve. They detested the political commissars sent from Paris. But more than they hated the revolution, they loved their guns. They were artists of destruction. So when the 36 Prussian batteries opened fire, the French batteries, numbering around 40 guns in total under the personal command of Kellermann, answered. And they answered with a speed and an accuracy that stunned the Duke of Brunswick. This was not the expected ragged, panicked fire of a disorganized mob. This was fast. It was precise. It was methodical. It was deadly. For 3, perhaps 4 solid hours, the 2 lines of artillery pounded each other across the muddy valley in the driving rain. It was the first great artillery duel of the modern age. The air filled with sulphurous, choking smoke, so thick that the gunners could barely see their targets, aiming only at the bright, terrifying flashes in the grey mist. Cannonballs tore through the air with a demonic, high-pitched shriek. Men were torn apart. Horses were eviscerated. The ground around Kellermann's windmill became a slaughterhouse, a cratered landscape of mud and blood, where human limbs were mixed with the splintered wood of broken gun carriages. But the French gunners, those cold-blooded professionals of the old regime, did not flinch. While Prussian guns were heavier and slower, the French Gribeauval guns were being served with terrifying speed. They could re-aim, reload, and fire faster, and their aim was better. The Prussian gun crews, who had expected to be firing at running targets, found themselves in a stationary duel against a superior force. They began to take serious, horrific casualties. Guns were dismounted as French shots smashed their carriages. Ammunition caissons exploded in massive, deafening flashes, vaporizing the crews around them. The Prussians were shocked. The scum of the earth, this rabble they had come to disperse, was out shooting them. The artillery duel, which was supposed to be the preamble to a rout, was not a rout at all. It was a stalemate, or worse. The French were winning it. This changed the entire calculation. Brunswick had expected to break their morale with cannons. Instead, the French were breaking Prussian cannons, and their morale, far from shattering, seemed to be hardening in the fire. The psychological foundation of the invasion, the assumption of professional superiority, was cracking. The mob was firing back with superior technology and superior skill. This could not stand. The artillery had failed to do the job. Very well, the infantry would have to do it instead. Brunswick, irritated, annoyed, but still utterly confident in his primary weapon, looked at his lines of disciplined Prussian infantry, the finest in the world. It was time to stop this noisy, messy, modern nonsense, and finish the battle in the proper way. He gave the order for the main assault. The great Prussian batteries finally, methodically, fell silent. The air, thick with sulphurous smoke and the cold sting of rain, now filled with a new, more terrifying sound. It was not the roar of cannons. It was the steady, metronomic, grinding beat of thousands of boots on wet earth. The Duke of Brunswick, his patience exhausted by this vulgar artillery duel, had given the order. His infantry, the dark blue-coated heirs of Frederick the Great, the famed automatons of the Prussian line, began to advance. This was it. This was the moment of decision. They advanced in their perfect, rigid formations, moving as a single, disciplined entity, a relentless blue wall designed to sweep the revolutionary rabble from the field. They were not charging. They were marching. It was a demonstration of absolute, chilling contempt. It was a statement. It said, "We do not even need to hurry. You are not soldiers. You are a disorganized mob. You will break." They were the finest infantry in Europe. They were professionals, and they were marching toward a line of amateurs. On the muddy slope of the Valmy hill, the sight of this approaching machine, this human glacier, was terrifying. The Bleus, the volunteers who had never seen combat, gripped their muskets. Their revolutionary élan, so potent in the clubs of Paris, felt very thin against 10,000 approaching bayonets. Their line, previously chaotic but determined, started to look fragile, porous, human. They began to shuffle nervously, their officers screaming at them to hold, to stand firm. And then, at the worst possible second, disaster struck. A Prussian shell, perhaps a lucky shot from the final salvo, or perhaps a brilliantly aimed one, found the French ammunition reserve near the windmill. A caisson, a wagon packed with gunpowder barrels and shot, exploded. It was a catastrophic detonation. A blinding flash, a deafening roar, and a column of black smoke tore a physical and psychological hole right in the centre of the French line. Men were vaporized. Horses and limbs were thrown into the air. The blast tore a gap 20 yards wide. Panic. Pure animal panic. This was the moment Brunswick was waiting for. This was the moment the mob would break. Soldiers looked at the gap. They looked at the approaching Prussians. They looked at each other. They began to turn. They looked behind them, towards the road to Paris, towards safety. They started to flee. The right flank of Kellermann's infantry began to dissolve. The battle was over. The revolution was finished. But François Christophe Kellermann saw it. The 67-year-old veteran, the Alsatian blank, who despised these panicked bleus, the man who believed only in iron discipline, saw his line breaking. He saw his professionals, his gunners, being abandoned by the volunteers. He saw the Prussians advancing, their bayonets starting to glint. He had a choice. He could order the retreat. He could save his own men, his professionals, and let the revolution fail, just as he always knew it would. He could save himself. But he did something else, something instinctive, something that was not in any drill manual. He did not run. He spurred his horse, a massive charger, and galloped directly into the gap, into the mass of panicked, fleeing men, right into the line of Prussian fire. He rode along the wavering front, a lone 67-year-old general. He was a man of the ancien regime, a man who had served the king his entire life. But in this moment, he made a choice that defined the new age. He drew his sabre. He took his officer's hat, with its new, garish, tricolour cockade, the symbol of the very revolution he distrusted, the symbol of the chaos that had murdered his fellow officers, and he jammed it onto the point of his sword. He raised it high above his head for all his men, bleus and blancs alike, to see. A single point of colour and defiance in the grey, smoky chaos. And he roared, his old parade ground voice cutting through the sound of cannons and the screams of the dying. Vive la Nation! Long live the nation! It was a thunderclap. It was an electric shock. The soldiers, the ones who were in the very act of running, stopped. They looked back. They saw their general, the old royalist, their general, not fleeing from the Prussians but riding towards them. They saw the hat. They heard the cry. It was a cry not for a king, not for a general, but for them, for the nation. It was electric. One man, a bleu volunteer, shouted it back, then a company, then the entire battalion. The panic died, smothered by this new, terrifying sound. From the other flank, Dumouriez, the politician, the pragmatist, saw his rival's brilliant, impulsive act of theatre and instantly understood its power. He rode to his own troops and did the same. The cry was caught by the wind. It swept across the entire French army, from the hill, down to the reserves, across to Dumouriez's men. 30,000, perhaps 40,000, terrified, ragged men found their voice. They turned back towards the Prussians. They raised their own hats on their bayonets, and they roared it back, a single, unified, deafening wave of sound that drowned out the cannons. Vive la Nation! It was the sound of an army being born. It was the sound of an idea, an abstract concept of the people, becoming a physical, terrifying, immovable object on a battlefield. The Duke of Brunswick, mounted on his horse, stared into the rain and the thick, sulphurous smoke. He had heard the thunder of the French artillery, a sound he had not expected, a sound of lethal, terrifying professionalism. But this was new. This was the sound of chaos itself, the sound of the sewer given a voice, the sound of a mob finding its collective, primal soul. Vive la Nation! It was a ragged, terrifying roar from 40,000 throats, a sound that did not belong on a civilized 18th century battlefield. Before him, his infantry, the most disciplined soldiers in the world, the men who could march into a hurricane and not break step, had stopped. They were confused. They were trained to fight other soldiers, other automatons like themselves, who obeyed the unspoken rules of linear warfare. They were not trained to fight an idea. Brunswick was a man of the old world. He saw this display not as courage, but as madness, as a complete epileptic breakdown of all human order. This was not war. This was a peasant uprising armed with superior cannon. He conferred with the King of Prussia, Frederick William II, who was also on the field, unnerved, visibly shaken by the ferocity of the French artillery and the sheer primal noise of the French line. The legend, perhaps apocryphal but perfect in its symbolism, says Brunswick simply shook his head, his face a mask of aristocratic disgust. "Wir schlagen hier nicht," he muttered. "We do not fight here." He gave the order to halt the advance. But was it just the shout? Was this truly a miracle, where a patriotic cry alone, a blast of hot air, turned back the most feared army in Europe? The revolutionary propaganda in Paris would certainly claim so. The truth, as always, was colder, wetter, and infinitely muddier. Brunswick stopped the attack because of three brutal, unavoidable calculations that had nothing to do with revolutionary spirit and everything to do with grim military arithmetic. His first calculation was the most immediate. The French artillery was better than his. His own guns, which were supposed to pound the French into submission, were taking heavy, unacceptable losses. His gunners, the professionals, were being systematically outclassed by the French professionals and their revolutionary Gribeauval guns. The French rate of fire was faster, their aim was more accurate. His own counter-battery fire was failing to silence them. His second calculation was tactical. The French position was strong. That hill, the windmill, it was a natural fortress, a bastion of mud and cannon. To take it, he would have to do the one thing his Frederican training screamed against. He would have to order a frontal assault, uphill, across a wet, open valley, straight into the teeth of that superior, unshaken artillery, against 40,000 men who, inexplicably, were not running away. It would be a slaughter. It would be a waste. It would be bad tactics. And Brunswick, if nothing else, was a methodical tactician. But the third and most important calculation, the one that truly sealed the decision, had nothing to do with the French. Brunswick looked not at the enemy, but at his own men. He looked at his invincible army, and he saw ghosts. They were shadows standing in the rain. For 2 weeks they had been marching through this God-forsaken, hostile, muddy landscape. Their supply lines from Germany, which relied on massive, slow-moving bread wagons drawn by civilian contractors, had simply collapsed. The Prussian army, unlike the French, had not modernized its logistics. They had marched into France expecting a short, glorious campaign, a promenade militaire to Paris. They had brought minimal supplies, expecting to live off the land, requisitioning food from a defeated and supposedly welcoming populace. But the French populace was not welcoming. They were hostile. This was not a war of kings. It was a war of people. Peasants burned their own crops, poisoned their wells, and formed guerrilla bands, the fédérés, that ambushed and slaughtered Prussian foraging parties. The police action had become a war against an entire nation. And so the Prussians began to starve. In their sodden camps, unable to get dry, unable to get bread, the inevitable happened. Sickness. Not just coughs and colds, but dysentery. The bloody flux, it swept through the Prussian army like wildfire. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a biological catastrophe. Soldiers, weakened by hunger, suffering from exposure, and drinking contaminated water from ditches shared with dead horses, were dying in their hundreds. The philosopher Goethe, who was accompanying the Duke of Weimar in the Prussian camp, wrote about it with horror. He described a camp of living spectres, of men huddled in the mud, their faces gaunt, their blue uniforms stained, their only concern not the enemy, but the simple, desperate search for bread that did not exist. Estimates from contemporary journals suggest that of the 42,000 Prussians who had marched so confidently into France, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 were now critically ill, too weak to hold a musket, let alone fix bayonets and charge uphill into cannon fire. This was the army Brunswick was being asked to lead in an assault. He realized the terrible, humiliating truth. He could not ask his army to attack, because his army could not attack. The roar of Vive la Nation was not what stopped the Prussians. It was merely the sound that played as the Prussian war machine finally ground to a halt, its gears choked with mud, sickness, and starvation. The battle, as a battle, simply ended. The Prussian infantry stood down. The French, stunned, held their hill. The artillery fire died away, replaced by the sound of the endless, miserable rain. There was no pursuit. There was no grand French cavalry charge. There was only a vast, mutual, stunned silence. And then the retreat began. For the next 10 days, the invincible Prussian army did not march from France. They fled. It was a rout, not by an army, but by nature itself. They left a trail of the dying. Men who collapsed from fever were left on the side of the road to be found by French peasants. Horses, dead from starvation, were ripped apart for their raw flesh. The army abandoned its cannons, its wagons, its pride, all of it swallowed by the same champagne mud that had consumed their supplies. And here Dumouriez, the political schemer, played his final, brilliant card. The politicians in Paris, drunk on this first taste of victory, were screaming for blood. They wanted the Prussians pursued, harassed, annihilated. They wanted the King of Prussia captured. Dumouriez did the opposite. He opened secret, unauthorized negotiations with Brunswick. He did not want to destroy the Prussian army. Why? Because Dumouriez was not a fanatic. He was a strategist. He did not want to destroy Prussia. He wanted to break the coalition. He saw Austria, not Prussia, as the true, implacable enemy of France. He let Brunswick go. He allowed the Prussian king to retreat with the shell of his army, to save face, sending a clear, cynical, diplomatic message. France is not your enemy. Austria is. This act of pragmatic treachery, letting a defeated army escape, was perhaps as strategically important as the cannonade itself. By the end of October, the last sick, starving Prussian soldier had stumbled back across the border. The great invasion was over. The road to Paris was safe. That night, in the soaking, miserable Prussian camp, there was no celebration. There was only mud, sickness, and a profound, bone-deep confusion. The professional Prussian army, the army of Frederick the Great, had advanced and then stopped. They had not been defeated. They had not been tactically outmaneuvered. They had simply failed. They had failed to disperse a mob. In that camp, shivering with the same cold and fever as the soldiers, was the great German poet, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He had accompanied his duke, Karl August, on this campaign, perhaps expecting a short, glorious adventure, a restoration of civilized order. Instead, he had witnessed this strange, anticlimactic, muddy confrontation. The officers around him, the Junker aristocracy, were in shock. They could not process what they had just witnessed. Their entire worldview, built on the certainty of their own innate superiority and the mechanical perfection of their drill, had been shattered by the sound of 40,000 Frenchmen screaming for the nation. They asked the poet, the philosopher, what he thought of it all. What did this bizarre, inconclusive day mean? Goethe, huddling in the rain, paused, and then he delivered the most famous prophecy of the modern age, a line that would define the battle far more than any tactical analysis ever could. From this place, he said, and from this day begins a new era in the history of the world, and you can all say you were present at its birth. Goethe was not a soldier. He was a poet. But he saw what the generals, including Brunswick, could not yet fully comprehend. The rules of warfare, the very mathematics of power that had governed Europe for centuries, had just been rendered obsolete. The old world had died. The world of Kabinettskriege, of cabinet wars, was over. Those were the wars of the 18th century, polite, professional, limited conflicts fought by highly trained, highly paid, and highly unmotivated armies. They were dynastic squabbles, wars of manoeuvre, where generals sought to capture a fortress here or a province there. They were, in essence, the games of kings. Soldiers were tools. often mercenaries or peasants pressed into service, who fought for pay or for feudal loyalty to a monarch they had never seen. They fought because they were told to, and they fought because they feared their own sergeants more than they feared the enemy. But the French at Valmy, this ragged collection of royalist veterans and shoemaker volunteers, they were not fighting for a man. They were not fighting for pay. They were fighting for an idea. They were fighting for la patrie, the nation. And this changed everything. The Prussian soldier was perhaps the finest military instrument ever devised. He was a human machine, drilled to obey instantly, to march into volley fire without flinching, to load and fire his musket 3 times a minute. But he was motivated by fear. Fear of the Spießrutenlaufen, the gauntlet. Fear of the officer's cane. He fought because he was told to, and he stopped when he was told to stop. The French soldier at Valmy was something new, something terrifying, something modern. He was chaotic. He was undisciplined. He was emotional. But he was fighting for himself. He was a citizen soldier. He believed that the ground he stood on was his soil. He believed the cannon he served was his property. He believed the nation was an abstract, mystical extension of his own will. This was the birth of nationalism as a decisive military weapon. Valmy was not, in a tactical sense, a great battle. It was a psychological confrontation. It was a test of wills. And the will of a nation, disorganized and chaotic as it was, proved stronger than the will of a king. This is the new era Goethe saw. For the first time, moral force had become a strategic factor, a measurable weight on the battlefield, as real and as powerful as a battery of Gribeauval cannon. Kellermann's cry of Vive la Nation was not just a morale boost, it was the deployment of this new weapon. It was the moment ideology was proven to be bulletproof. And the consequences were immediate. They were seismic. While the Prussian army was beginning its long, agonizing dissolution in the mud of Champagne, the news of Valmy, not as a great victory, but simply as a stand, raced back to Paris. It arrived like a jolt of electricity. The politicians in the new National Convention, who had been bracing for the sound of Prussian guns on the outskirts of the city, were electrified. The army had not run. The army had held. The great, fearsome Prussian machine had been stopped by the very volunteers they had so fearfully sent to the front. This single piece of news gave them the courage, the political cover, they needed to take the final, irreversible step. On September 21st, 1792, the very day after the battle, the National Convention met in Paris. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of destiny, a feeling that the hand of God, or perhaps history, had intervened. The motion was put forward. It was simple. It was profound. The monarchy is abolished in France. It passed unanimously. 1,000 years of French kings, a dynasty stretching back to Hugh Capet, a sacred line anointed by the Church, was erased from history in a single afternoon with a single vote. They were no longer the subjects of King Louis. They were the citizens of the French Republic. Make no mistake, this was not a coincidence. The First French Republic was proclaimed not by the philosophers in their salons, but by the royalist gunners and the revolutionary volunteers standing fast on a muddy hill. The Republic was born in the smoke of Valmy. The deputies in Paris could only dare to depose their king because Kellermann and Dumouriez had proven that they could, in fact, defend the nation. The cannonade at Valmy was the Republic's baptism by fire. The old world of kings and professionals had tested the new world of peoples and ideas, and the old world had blinked first. But Valmy's legacy was not just political, it was profoundly military. It was not an end, but a beginning. The moment the broken sword of France was reforged. That muddy hill was a crucible, a violent laboratory proving a world-changing hypothesis. The new France needed both of its warring halves to survive. It needed the cold, disciplined professionalism of the blanks. Their hands, steady on the Gribeauval cannons, their knowledge of drill, their grim understanding of the mathematics of war. This was the skeleton. But it also needed the raw, chaotic passion of the bleus, their willingness to die for an idea, their patriotic elan, their sheer, inexhaustible numbers. This was the heart. Valmy was the first time these two opposing forces had truly faced the enemy together, and held. The politicians in Paris, led by men like Lazare Carnot, the organizer of victory, understood this lesson instantly. They initiated the amalgame, the amalgamation. This was a stroke of administrative genius, a forced fusion of the old and the new. They shattered the old royal regiments and distributed their veteran battalions among the new volunteer blue battalions. A single unit of blancs, perhaps 500 men strong, would be sandwiched by 2 units of bleu, perhaps 1,000 men. The veterans became the spine, the hardcore of professionalism, teaching the new recruits how to load a musket under fire, how to stand. The volunteers, in turn, wrapped this corps in a layer of revolutionary fervour. This new formation, the demi-brigade, became the fundamental building block, the very DNA, of the army that would eventually conquer Europe. But this new army needed mass. It needed numbers on a scale the old kings could never have dreamed of. And the miracle at Valmy, the proof that the rabble could stand, gave the National Convention the political confidence to make the most terrifying decision of the entire revolution. On August 23, 1793, they decreed the levée en masse. This was not conscription as any nation had known it. This was total war. It was the mobilization of an entire society. The decree was absolute. From this moment until that in which the enemy shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. The young men shall go to battle, the married men shall forge arms and transport provisions, the women shall make tents and clothes. This was not a king's war. This was the nation itself rising in arms. Within a year, France had put an army of nearly 800,000 men into the field, an ocean of manpower that dwarfed every other army in Europe combined. But how do you use this new weapon? How do you make 800,000 shopkeepers and farmers fight the disciplined lines of Prussia? The answer was simple, and it was brutal. You don't. You don't try to copy Frederick the Great's perfect, fragile lines. That took years of soul-crushing drill, years France did not have. You use the one thing you do have. You use their passion. You use their élan. French commanders stopped trying to fight a war of manoeuvre and firepower. They invented a new war, a war of mass and shock. They kept their superior artillery, the legacy of Gribeauval, to blast a hole in the enemy line. But instead of following up with thin, precise lines of infantry, they massed their new volunteers into massive attack columns, sometimes 30 to 50 ranks deep. These columns were tactically clumsy. They could only fire from the first few ranks. They were perfect targets for artillery. But they had one overwhelming advantage: psychological momentum. They would advance across the battlefield, a deep, screaming river of humanity, a bayonet-tipped battering ram, often to the sound of La Marseillaise. They would march directly into the disciplined volleys of the Allies, taking horrific, staggering casualties. But there were always more men behind them. And while the thin, professional lines of the old regimes could fire 2 or 3 volleys, they could not withstand the sheer, primal, physical, and psychological impact of 1,000 men charging them, screaming, willing to die. The line would break. The column would punch through. This was the tactic, the ordre profond, that would dominate European battlefields for the next 23 years. It would carry French flags from the sands of Egypt to the frozen gates of Moscow. And it was all born on that muddy hill at Valmy, the day the world learned that a new kind of army, an army of citizens, an army driven by an idea, had arrived. The Battle of Valmy was not a tactical masterpiece. It was not a Blenheim or an Austerlitz. There was no brilliant flanking manoeuvre. There was no devastating cavalry charge that shattered the enemy line. It was, by the brutal standards of the wars to come, little more than a skirmish, an affair of outposts. The total casualties for the day, across both of these massive armies, were fewer than 500 men. A bloody afternoon perhaps, but not a battle that would, by its numbers, change the fate of empires. It was a dirty, inconclusive artillery duel fought in a miserable, driving rain. The Prussians did not break and flee in terror. The French did not pursue them with bayonets. The battle just stopped. It fizzled out in the mud and the sickness. And yet, this is the paradox of Valmy. This is why it matters. Because war is never just mathematics. It is psychology. It is a contest of wills. On that rainy September 20th, 1792, the professional army of the old world, the flawless, mechanical, soulless product of the ancien regime, advanced, expecting to disperse a panicked rabble. They expected fear. They expected obedience. They expected the natural order of things, where kings command and peasants run, to assert itself. But the rabble did not run. The rabble stood. The shoemakers and the lawyers, the bleus and the blancs, the veteran gunners and the terrified volunteers held the hill. They stood in the rain, under the fire of the most feared artillery in Europe, and they roared back with one voice, a new, terrifying sound. Vive la Nation! In that moment, the Duke of Brunswick, the old master of a dead form of warfare, blinked. He saw an army that was not fighting for pay, but for an idea, and he realized he could not break it. The poet Goethe, standing in the Prussian camp, understood what the generals did not. From this place and from this day, he wrote, begins a new era in the history of the world. He was right. Valmy was not a victory of arms. It was a victory of the human will. It was the birth certificate of the French Republic, signed by royalist gunners. It was the moment the revolution proved it could defend itself. And it was the birth of the army that, armed with this new ideological fire, would soon march out of France and consume the continent.